Have you ever had that creeping suspicion, just like a whisper in the back of your mind while you're driving to work, or like staring at the ceiling at 2 in the morning that you might be playing a role in your own life instead of actually living it?
Oh, yeah. That 2 a.m. panic, it's universal.
Right. You know the exact feeling I'm talking about. You're checking all the boxes. You're doing literally everything society, your parents, your friends told you to do.
You're following the script.
Exactly, the script. But at the end of the day, you are just utterly exhausted by all the social masks you have to wear.
It's draining.
It is. Or maybe you've even achieved the success you were aiming for, like the promotion, the relationship, the house, and you're just sitting there wondering why it feels so surprisingly empty.
Yeah, it's a profound paradox that so many of us face. I mean, we spend decades pouring our life force into building this highly specific identity. We curate it, we protect it.
We polish it for social media.
Exactly, we polish it constantly, only to wake up one day with this terrifying realization that the identity we built it's basically a straitjacket.
Wow. A straitjacket.
Yeah, because it doesn't actually fit who we are underneath. And in many cases, it never really did. We just wore it because we thought we had to.
So that terrifying realization is our focal point for today, because we are doing a deep dive, decoding the underlying science, the deep psychology, and just the raw reality of becoming who you were actually meant to be.
And we really want to bypass the superficial stuff here.
Yeah, definitely. We're skipping the usual self-help platitudes you see floating around the internet. Like today, this deep dive is specifically for you, the listener, to cut through all that noise.
So what are we looking at today?
Well, we've pulled together a massive stack of research. We've got humanistic theory from Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow, depth psychology from Carl Jung, Brene Brown's incredible research on vulnerability.
Oh, her work is essential for this.
Absolutely. Plus, Lindsay C. Gibson's clinical work on emotionally immature parents, and even practical frameworks like acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT.
That's a powerhouse lineup of sources. And the goal here is not just to understand the theory, the what of authentic living, but the actual why and the how.
Right. Okay, let's unpack this. We want to know what is happening in your brain and your body when you abandon yourself, and more importantly, how you can engineer a return to your true nature.
Yeah, we have to move past this poetic notion of finding yourself as if your true self is like a set of lost car keys hiding under the couch.
Right, like you're just going to stumble upon it one day.
Exactly. We're going to examine the biological imperatives, the childhood adaptations, and the neurological defenses that govern how you show up in the world.
But before we can even begin to talk about stripping away the performance and all that, we have to deal with the core assumption of this whole concept.
It's
Does a true self actually exist scientifically? Because, it's very easy to argue that human beings are just highly adaptable blank slates, right?
Sure, the idea that we're entirely shaped by our environment.
Yeah. We're shaped by our traumas, our cultures. So, scientifically speaking, is there an innate you in there, or is that just a comforting illusion to make us feel special?
Well, to get to the bottom of that, we really have to look at one of the most radical shifts in the history of psychology.
Back in the mid-20th century, right?
Right. Back then, the field was dominated by psychoanalysis, which largely viewed humans as being driven by these dark, destructive urges. And then on the other side, you had behaviorism.
Which treated us like biological machines.
Exactly, just responding to punishments and rewards. But then Carl Rogers, who was one of the founders of humanistic psychology, introduced a concept that completely upended the field. He called it the actualizing tendency.
Okay, wait. And he didn't mean that in a metaphorical, like, reach for the stars kind of way, did he?
Not at all. Rogers defined the actualizing tendency as a hardwired biological evolutionary drive. It is present in every single living organism.
Wow. Every organism.
Yes, it's the innate mechanism that compels an organism to grow, to heal, to maintain itself, and to ultimately fulfill its complex potential. Like, it is as fundamental to your biology as your respiratory system.
Okay, I really want to emphasize this because it changes everything.
Right.
We treat the desire for self-improvement or authenticity like it's a luxury.
Right, like a weekend hobby.
Yeah, like a hobby you pick up if you have enough disposable income. But Rogers is saying this drive is equivalent to cellular division. It's a biological imperative to become the fullest version of whatever you are designed to be.
And what's fascinating here is how Rogers illustrated this. He used what's often referred to as the potato metaphor, and I think it captures the raw, unrelenting nature of this drive perfectly.
I love this metaphor. Walk us through it.
Okay, so imagine you buy a bag of potatoes. You take one out for dinner, but the rest get pushed to the back of a dark, cold pantry. You shut the door and completely forget about them. Now, the environment is terrible. There's no soil, there's no water, there's virtually no light.
Literally the worst place for a plant.
Exactly.
Mm.
But when you finally discover that bag weeks or maybe months later, the potatoes haven't just sat there waiting to die. They have grown these pale, bizarre-looking white sprouts.
It's almost creepy looking when you find them.
It is. But they are stretching, sometimes a foot long, reaching desperately for the tiny, tiny sliver of light coming from the crack under the pantry door.
So they are mobilizing every ounce of stored energy they have left just to fight for life.
Exactly. Even in a completely toxic, unaccommodating environment, the biology refuses to just give up.
That is incredible, the actualizing tendency in action.
Yeah. Rogers observed that this drive cannot be destroyed unless the organism itself is destroyed. It can be severely suppressed, sure.
And distorted, right?
Yes. Distorted so badly that the growth looks twisted and unhealthy like those pale, fragile sprouts instead of a vibrant green plant. But it never stops pushing. On a cellular level, you are constantly trying to actualize.
I have to admit, that completely rewrites how I've always viewed self-actualization. Because when most people hear that phrase, they immediately think of Abraham Maslow, right?
Oh, absolutely. Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
Yeah, we all learned about it in high school. You picture that famous pyramid. At the bottom, you have food and shelter, then safety, then love, then esteem.
And way up at the very tip of the pyramid.
Sitting in the penthouse suite is self-actualization. And the implication has always been that you only get to worry about who you really are after you've made enough money, secured a stable relationship, gotten everybody to respect you.
Which makes it feel like an elite country club.
Exactly, for like the top 1% of humanity who have all their other stuff together.
Right. And Maslow's model has been incredibly influential, especially in corporate environments. But it has a massive flaw when applied to everyday human suffering. Well, Maslow viewed self-actualization as the apex of human development. Like the finish line you cross only after all the messy earthly problems are solved. But Rogers looked at the exact same human condition and saw the opposite.
He flipped it.
He completely flipped it. For Rogers, the actualizing tendency isn't the finish line. It is the starting block. It's the engine that powers the whole journey. It's a continuous universal force operating in everyone every single day, regardless of their socioeconomic status.
So we all have this relentless internal engine trying to push us toward our true potential. But, well, if that engine is always running, why do we experience so much internal conflict? Like, how does this biological drive relate to the psychological experience of knowing who you are?
The conflict arises because human beings, unlike potatoes, have complex consciousness and social structures. Rogers broke our psychological experience of identity down into 3 overlapping domains.
Okay, let's break those down for the listener.
First, you have the perceived self. This is your internal narrative. It's how you view yourself when you look in the mirror, your subjective self-image.
Which is notoriously unreliable, right? I mean, we often perceive ourselves as far less capable or far more flawed than we actually are.
Highly unreliable, yes. Then you have the actual or real self. This is how you objectively exist in the physical and social world.
Yeah.
It's the aggregate of your behaviors, how others experience you, the tangible reality of your daily life.
Okay, so that's 2. What's the third?
Finally, you have the ideal self. This is your aspiration. It's the person you are striving to become, the highest vision of your values and capabilities.
So we have the story we tell ourselves, the reality of how we act, and the vision of who we want to be. I imagine the goal is to get all 3 of those circles in a Venn diagram to perfectly overlap.
Precisely. Rogers called that state of overlap congruence. When your perceived self, your actual self, and your ideal self are largely in alignment, you experience profound psychological health.
We feel a sense of flow.
Yes, flow. You don't have
Yeah.
to spend mental energy pretending to be someone else. You are authentic, and because you're authentic, your biological actualizing tendency has a clear, unobstructed path to operate.
But let me push back on this a little bit. If this drive to grow is as natural as a plant reaching for the sun, and we are biologically wired to seek this state of congruence, why is society experiencing an epidemic of burnout?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right. Why do so many of us feel like those wilted potatoes stuck in the dark, stretching in weird directions just to survive? What is the psychological equivalent of the dark pantry?
To understand the mechanism of that suppression, we have to shift our focus from innate biology to the environments we are planted in during our most formative years. We have to look at the work of clinical psychologist Lindsay C. Gibson.
She studies emotionally immature parents, right?
Yes, she spent her career studying the profound, lifelong impacts of growing up with emotionally immature or inaccessible caregivers.
This is where it gets real heavy. Because as a child, you are entirely captive.
Completely.
You don't get to choose your soil. You don't get to evaluate the psychological health of your parents and say, you know what, this environment isn't conducive to my actualizing pendency. I'm going to relocate.
That would be nice, but no.
You are utterly dependent on them for food, shelter, survival.
And that dependency creates a terrifying biological dilemma. If a child grows up in an environment where emotional support is scarce, or where love and safety are highly conditional upon the child behaving in a very narrow, specific way.
The child's nervous system detects a massive threat.
Exactly. The nervous system detects a threat to survival. The child intuitively understands they cannot change the parents. The parents are immovable objects. So to ensure survival, the child turns the mechanism of adaptation inward. They change themselves.
They sever the connection to their actualizing tendency.
They bury it. They abandon what Gibson calls their true self, their genuine needs, their natural curiosities, their spontaneous emotional reactions, and in its place, they construct a role self.
A role self.
Right. A role self is a highly engineered persona designed to perfectly fit the specific dysfunctions of the family system.
Let's unpack the mechanics of that, because it isn't a conscious choice. A 5-year-old isn't sitting in their bedroom strategizing a PR campaign for the family dinner table.
No, it's entirely subconscious. It's driven by the amygdala and the nervous system's need to avoid abandonment. The child figures out the unwritten rules of the ecosystem.
Give me an example.
Well, maybe they realize, if I am the absolute perfectionist who gets straight A's and never asks for help, my parents look at me with pride instead of annoyance. Or they realize, if I am completely invisible, quiet, and demand nothing, I don't trigger my father's explosive anger.
So they become whatever is needed. The caretaker, the clown, the overachiever, or the scapegoat.
Exactly. And the tragic part is, the child believes this performance is a temporary transaction that will eventually pay out. Gibson talks about this deeply ingrained subconscious mechanism called the healing fantasy.
The healing fantasy. That sounds, it sounds heartbreaking, honestly.
It is. The healing fantasy is one of the most powerful and destructive forces in adult psychology. It's the child's desperate, foundational belief that if they just play their assigned role self perfectly enough and endure the pain for long enough,
They'll finally win the love they need.
right, they will eventually unlock the unconditional love, the emotional connection, and the healing they are starving for. It's a psychological contract the child makes with themselves. If I am perfect, they will finally love me.
But the payout never comes. Because the parent's inability to give unconditional love isn't a reaction to the child's behavior. It's a limitation of the parent's own emotional maturity.
Exactly. The child is trying to unlock a door that doesn't actually have a keyhole.
Wow. And this maps perfectly onto Carl Rogers' theory, doesn't it? He used a very specific term for this dynamic. He called them conditions of worth.
Yes. Society, culture, and especially families are constantly placing conditions of worth upon us. The message is rarely you are inherently valuable. The message is you are valuable if.
You're valuable if you go to this specific college.
You're lovable if you suppress your anger. You're acceptable if you shrink your body to fit this standard.
And Rogers described these conditions of worth as layers of heavy paper constantly piling up on top of a person, right?
Like a slow burial. Year after year, expectation after expectation, the layers accumulate. Eventually, the true self is buried so deep under the weight of these conditions that the person forgets it even exists.
They start believing they are the pile of paper. They identify completely with the role self.
And the physiological and psychological cost of living that way for decades is just staggering.
It has to be. When you spend your entire life modulating your behavior, suppressing your natural impulses, and maintaining a false public identity, you eventually hit a wall.
In existential philosophy, they call it the existential vacuum. It's this profound, haunting sense of emptiness. And clinically, it almost always manifests as chronic, unexplainable, bone-deep fatigue.
Because it requires massive amounts of neurological and physiological energy to repress your authentic nature.
It's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. You can do it, sure, but your arms are going to shake, your muscles will burn, and you will eventually exhaust yourself.
Think of it like wearing a heavy suit of medieval armor. Like, as a child, you put that armor on because you lived in a war zone. Your home environment was chaotic or emotionally barren or highly critical.
And that armor, your role self, your perfectionism, your people-pleasing, It literally saved your psychological life.
It deflected the arrows.
Yes.
But now, you're 35 or 40 years old, you have your own apartment, a stable job, you're walking through a peaceful park on a sunny afternoon, and you are still wearing 100 pounds of rusting metal.
That's such a perfect analogy.
You're looking around at other people who are just enjoying the sunshine, and you're wondering why every single step you take requires so much agonizing effort. You are exhausted because you are defending yourself against a war that ended 20 years ago.
And the real tragedy of the human condition is that the armor becomes so familiar, we fuse with it. We mistake the heavy, restrictive metal for our own skin.
So how does a break happen?
Eventually, the biological imperative, the actualizing tendency we talked about, gathers enough force that it starts pushing against the metal. The fatigue sets in, the unexplained anxiety spikes, the depressive episodes become more frequent, the entire system starts to buckle under the strain.
But the fascinating perspective shift here is how we view that breakdown, because is this crisis actually a pathology? Is it a disease that needs to be suppressed with more willpower?
Well, according to the work of Polish psychiatrist Kazimierz Dabrowski, we have fundamentally misunderstood the nature of this suffering.
Yes, Dabrowski's theory of positive disintegration. This is where the material gets really counterintuitive for a lot of people, because if I'm having a breakdown, if my career suddenly feels meaningless and my relationships feel hollow, my immediate instinct is to think I am broken.
Right, you think, I need to fix this immediately so I can get back to normal.
Exactly. But Dabrowski argues that normal was the sickness.
Yes. Dabrowski proposed that severe emotional distress, periods of intense anxiety, and existential crises are very often not symptoms of mental illness, but rather vital, necessary signs of profound psychological growth.
Positive disintegration.
He called it positive disintegration. Because the structure of your life, the role self, the armor, the false identity, it has to physically and psychologically disintegrate before you can reorganize into a higher, more complex and authentic state of being.
I can hear people listening to this right now feeling a wave of resistance. Let me play devil's advocate for a second.
Please do.
If someone is having panic attacks in the grocery store because their life feels like a lie, it doesn't feel positive. It feels terrifying. It feels like they are losing their mind. How do we differentiate between a genuine mental health crisis that requires medical intervention and this biological drive trying to break out of the armor?
It is a critical distinction.
Yeah.
And obviously, severe psychological distress should always be evaluated by a professional. But from a developmental standpoint, the mechanism of positive disintegration is defined by its ultimate trajectory.
Okay, explain that.
A destructive breakdown leads to chronic apathy, harm, and a shrinking of the self. A positive disintegration, while incredibly painful, is characterized by a deep, agonizing internal conflict about values.
Values.
Yes. The pain comes from the friction between who you are currently acting like and a sudden, undeniable awareness of who you actually ought to be. The pain is the actualizing tendency saying, I refuse to survive in this confined artificial space anymore. The old structure must die so the true organism can breathe.
It's the seedling literally shattering the seed pod. The pod has to be destroyed for the plant to grow.
Exactly.
Okay, so if you are in the middle of this, the armor is cracking, the role self is draining the life out of you, and you realize you have to let it fall apart. If the first half of our lives is spent unconsciously building up that armor, building the ego to survive our childhoods in a peace society.
It sounds like the entire project of the second half of life is consciously taking it off.
Exactly. But how do you systematically dismantle your own identity without completely losing your grip on reality?
Well, for the blueprint of that specific dismantling, we have to journey into the work of the legendary Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung. Jung dedicated his life to mapping this exact transition. It's a deeply challenging psychological process he called individuation.
Individuation. We hear that word thrown around a lot in pop psychology, usually as a synonym for just being independent or, unique.
Right, like finding your personal style. But Jung meant something much, much more specific. Look at the root of the word itself. To become an individual means to become an undivided, indivisible, whole entity.
Because right now, we're divided.
Jung believed that the vast majority of adults are deeply divided. We are fragmented into pieces. To achieve true wholeness, we must deliberately and often painfully separate our true nature from what Eastern philosophies often call the acquired mind.
The acquired mind.
Yes. The acquired mind is the massive accumulation of conditioning, the inherited beliefs, the fears, and the societal scripts we absorb passively from our environment. Individuation is the process of untangling the authentic thread of your being from the massive knot of everyone else's expectations.
And Jung breaks this monumental task down into definitive stages. And the very first stage of individuation requires us to shed the persona.
The persona is the psychological equivalent of the armor we were just discussing. It's the social mask we wear to negotiate with the external world. It's the professional, agreeable, competent face we put on when we walk into the office or attend a family gathering.
But the danger isn't that we have a mask. I mean, we need a mask to function in society. You can't just be your raw, unfiltered self while ordering a coffee or giving a quarterly presentation.
No, society would collapse.
Right. The danger is that we forget we are wearing it.
Exactly the issue. The first critical step to wholeness is achieving the cognitive distance to realize, on a visceral level, that you are not your mask. Your job title as a senior manager, your reputation as the reliable one in your friend group, your status as a parent, these are roles you play. They are functions you perform.
They aren't the totality of your consciousness.
Exactly. When you strip away the resume, the bank account, and the social reputation, what is left? Facing that void is the first step.
Okay, so step one is disidentifying with the resume and the social character. That is difficult, but it makes rational sense. But then Jung takes us to stage two.
Yes, and this is where the process gets incredibly intense and, frankly, kind of terrifying. Stage two is the necessity of integrating the shadow.
Now, shadow work has become a massive trend on social media lately. You see TikToks about journaling to fix your shadow. But what is the actual clinical Jungian definition of the shadow?
In Jungian depth psychology, the shadow is the repository of all the disowned, repressed, and rejected fragments of our personality. Remember the child building the role self.
Yeah, shoving parts of themselves down to survive.
Right. When we were constructing our persona to please our parents and secure our place in society, we had to get rid of any traits that threatened our survival. If your parents punished anger, you took your natural capacity for anger and locked it in the basement of your subconscious.
If society told you that being fiercely ambitious was unlikable, you locked your ambition in the basement.
Your sexuality, your selfishness, your weirdness, your aggression, anything deemed unacceptable by your specific environment was shoved into the dark. That basement is the shadow.
Let me stop you right there, because this is where my own skepticism flares up, and I know it's a massive hurdle for a lot of people.
Go ahead.
If the shadow contains all our darkest, most socially unacceptable, rejected traits, why on earth would I want to go poking around down there? If I have successfully repressed my rage and my selfishness, shouldn't I leave them locked up?
It's a very logical question.
Right, because if I let the shadow out, won't that turn me into a monster? Won't that destroy my career and alienate my family?
It is the most common and profound fear people have about shadow work. We assume that integrating the shadow means giving in to our worst impulses, but the psychological mechanism of repression operates on a terrifying paradox. Jung warned us with one of his most famous observations.
Which is?
Whatever you refuse to bring into the light of consciousness will run your life from the dark, and you will call it fate.
That is a chilling concept. Run your life from the dark.
Because repressing a trait doesn't destroy the trait. It just removes it from your conscious control. These fragmented parts of yourself are alive, and they require immense physiological energy to keep submerged. And because they are starved of light, they mutate. They fester.
Give me an example of how that mutates.
Well, when you repress your natural boundary-setting anger, it doesn't vanish. It leaks out sideways as toxic passive aggression. When you repress your ambition, it turns into bitter resentment toward your colleague's success. Or, most commonly, we project our shadow onto others.
Oh, project.
Yes. The trait we absolutely hate in our neighbor or our coworker is almost always a disowned piece of our own shadow staring back at us.
So the monster is already driving the car. We are just blindfolded in the passenger seat, pretending we are in control.
That is the perfect way to frame it. Shadow integration, which is vastly different and much more demanding than just doing superficial shadow work prompts in a notebook, is not about acting out destructively. It is about taking the blindfold off.
You're going down into the basement.
You're walking down into the basement, bringing the monster up to the living room, pouring it a cup of coffee, and understanding what it actually wants.
You are making the unconscious conscious. You are removing the element of surprise.
Yes. By acknowledging that you contain the capacity for ruthlessness or deep selfishness or raw anger, you rob those traits of their subconscious autonomy. You integrate them to your whole self.
And when you do that, you regain access to the energy you were using to repress them.
Exactly. You learn to wield those traits consciously. You can finally choose how and when to use your aggression to protect a boundary rather than having it erupt uncontrollably and ruin a relationship. You harness the raw power of the shadow instead of being possessed by it.
That structural integration leads directly to what Jung called the transcendent function, which sounds mystical, but it's actually a very practical psychological state, isn't it?
Very practical. The transcendent function is the ultimate objective of the individuation process. It's the hard-won ability to hold the immense tension between opposing forces within your own psyche without snapping.
Give me a practical example of holding that tension. What does that actually look like in a human brain?
Imagine a parent who deeply, profoundly loves their children, but simultaneously feels intense, suffocating resentment about the loss of their personal freedom and career.
Which is super common.
Very common. Now, in a fragmented state, the persona says, I must only be a loving, grateful parent, so the resentment is shoved into the shadow, where it ferments into depression or sudden outbursts of inexplicable rage.
But what if they achieve the transcendent function?
Then the individual can sit in the tension of both realities. They can say, I am fiercely devoted to my family, and I am deeply resentful of the sacrifices required. Instead of splitting themselves in half and going to war internally, they hold the tension.
The mythological scholar Joseph Campbell interpreted this as opening your eyes at the center of the cross of opposites.
Yes. When you stop fighting your own contradictions, a new transcendent perspective emerges. You act out of complete, whole knowledge of who you are.
Acting out of whole knowledge. It's a profound shift in operating systems. But let's ground this. Let's say we do the heavy lifting. We recognize the actualizing tendency. We realize our role self is exhausting us. We shed the persona. We journey into the basement, face the shadow, and achieve that center point of tension.
The philosophical work is done.
Right. But tomorrow is still Tuesday. You still have to commute, attend meetings, talk to your spouse. What does this new, integrated, authentic life actually look like in motion? How does it alter the fabric of your daily existence?
Once internal wholeness is achieved, it demands external manifestation. You cannot achieve individuation and then keep living a fragmented life. Your behaviors have to change. And this introduces the concept of absolute integrity.
This is where the work of Dr. Martha Beck comes in. She wrote an incredible book called The Way of Integrity, and she uses Dante's Divine Comedy as the ultimate psychological roadmap for this exact transition.
That's a brilliant comparison.
Right. Dante starts his journey lost in a dark wood of error, confused, exhausted, terrified. That dark wood is the perfect literary metaphor for the incongruence and the existential vacuum we were talking about earlier. It's the life of the role self. And Beck makes this incredibly bold, uncompromising statement. She writes, integrity is the cure for psychological suffering, period.
It's a massive claim, but it is heavily supported by clinical outcomes. The problem is our modern misunderstanding of the word integrity.
Yeah, we view it through a moralistic lens. We think it means being a good person, not lying on your taxes, returning a wallet you found on the street.
But Beck is pointing us back to the original structural definition of the word. The root is integer, meaning whole, intact, undivided. A bridge has structural integrity when all its parts are aligned and carrying weight properly.
So psychological integrity means your internal reality, your true thoughts, feelings, and values, and your external actions in the world are perfectly matched. There is zero division.
Exactly. To make that structural integrity actionable, we can look at the framework developed by psychologist Stephen Joseph. He studied authenticity extensively and distilled it down to a triadic formula.
3 sequential steps. Know yourself, plus own yourself, plus be yourself equals the authentic life.
The elegance of the formula hides how incredibly difficult it is to execute. Let's break down the mechanics of each phase. The first step, know yourself, requires breaking through the acquired mind.
Meaning?
It means developing the internal quietness and mindfulness necessary to actually hear your own inner voice over the deafening constant roar of societal expectations, algorithmically driven media, and family pressures.
It's the radical act of noticing what actually gives your physical body energy and what physically drains you, rather than just doing what your intellect thinks you should do.
It's turning off the GPS that someone else programmed and finally looking at the actual terrain.
But then comes step 2, which is own yourself. And if I'm being honest, when I look at this framework, owning yourself seems like the most brutal part of the process.
Always the crucible where most people abandon the journey.
Because knowing who you are is one thing. Taking responsibility for it is another universe entirely.
Owning yourself requires radical, uncompromising accountability. It means looking in the mirror and accepting every part of your history. You have to own your past mistakes, your failures, and crucially, your shadow traits, without a shred of self-deception, justification, or blame.
You have to stop pointing fingers at your emotionally immature parents, your terrible boss, or your circumstances.
You have to stand there and say, regardless of how I got here, I am making the choices now. I am the architect of my current reality. The cognitive dissonance that generates is painful, but it is the only way to reclaim your agency.
And once you survive the crucible of owning yourself, you move to the final variable. Be yourself. This is where the internal work collides with the external world.
Right, because the first two steps are largely internal. They happen in your psyche. The third step requires behavioral application. Being yourself means aligning your daily, physical actions with what you now know and own.
It means having the audacity to say no to obligations that drain your energy, even if it disappoints people. It means establishing firm boundaries.
It means speaking your actual truth in a meeting or to your partner, even when your voice is shaking and your heart is pounding.
And speaking your truth when your voice is shaking is the perfect gateway into the groundbreaking research of Dr. Brené Brown. Because you cannot execute the be yourself slice of the formula without stepping into the arena of vulnerability.
You really can't.
You cannot be authentic in the real world without opening yourself up to the very real possibility of judgment and criticism. Authenticity demands massive, sustained vulnerability.
Vulnerability is the inescapable toll you have to pay to travel the road of the authentic life. Brown's decades of qualitative research reveal the exact mechanism of our resistance. We avoid vulnerability at all costs because we are fundamentally terrified of shame.
And shame is not just guilt.
No, guilt is, I did something bad. Shame is the deeply rooted, paralyzing conviction that I am bad. It's the fear that if people see our true self, they will realize we are fundamentally flawed and unworthy of love or belonging.
And to protect ourselves from that agonizing feeling of shame, we build defense mechanisms. And this is where Brown's work hits so hard because she deconstructs the defense mechanism of perfectionism.
It's so prevalent.
In our culture, we wear perfectionism like a badge of honor. It's the ultimate humble brag. You go into a job interview and they ask for your biggest weakness and you say, oh, I'm just too much of a perfectionist. I have incredibly high standards. We think perfectionism is about striving for excellence.
But Brown completely dismantles that myth. She shows that perfectionism has absolutely nothing to do with high standards. It is a 20-ton defensive shield.
A defensive shield.
The psychology of perfectionism is profoundly fear-based. We drag this massive shield around with us everywhere we go, operating under the subconscious delusion that if we look perfect, if we live perfectly, if we execute every task flawlessly, we can entirely avoid the painful sting of blame, judgment, and shame.
We believe perfection is the ultimate armor for the role self.
But the armor is crushing us.
Because perfection is a statistical and biological impossibility for a human being.
Right. Perfectionism is the ultimate manifestation of the role self, because it requires you to constantly monitor the external environment to see what perfect looks like to the people around you, and then contort yourself to match it.
And Brown emphasizes that what she calls wholehearted living, which is synonymous with the authentic life, requires us to systematically dismantle that shield.
It requires the immense courage to look at your flawed, unfinished, messy self and declare that you are inherently worthy of love and belonging exactly as you are in this current second.
You are choosing the truth of your own authenticity over the temporary safety of other people's approval.
And we must recognize the context we are doing this in. We live in an economic and social system that literally profits from our insecurities. Billions of dollars are made by convincing you that you are flawed and need to buy something, achieve something, or look like something to be acceptable.
In that environment, choosing authenticity, dropping the shield of perfectionism, and declaring your own unconditional worthiness is not just a personal psychological shift. It is a profound, radical act of defiance. Okay, the philosophical and psychological depth here is staggering. We have mapped the journey from the biological actualizing tendency through the trauma of the role self, down into Jungian shadow integration, and out into the vulnerable arena of structural integrity.
We've covered a lot of ground.
But understanding the map doesn't move your feet. Theory is useless without application. Let's pivot and get incredibly practical. If I am listening to this on my commute or while washing the dishes and I realize my whole life is a role self, what do I actually do tomorrow morning?
How do we operationalize this?
Exactly. The sources provide some highly tactical, science-based frameworks, heavily drawing from acceptance and commitment therapy, or ACT, and the field of positive psychology.
ACT is a remarkably effective framework for this exact transition because it doesn't try to just make you feel good.
What does it focus on?
It focuses on building psychological flexibility, the ability to be present with difficult emotions, and relentlessly aligning your physical actions with your self-defined core values. One of the foundational cognitive tools used in ACT to help people break out of the acquired mind is a visualization exercise known as the magic wand metaphor.
I want to walk through this because it is deceptively simple but incredibly revealing.
The human brain is an absolute master at generating plausible excuses to keep us safe and maintain the status quo. If I ask you what you really want, your brain instantly floods you with limitations. I don't have the time. I don't have the capital. My spouse won't support it. What if I fail publicly?
The excuses just pile up instantly.
So the magic wand exercise is designed to neurobiologically bypass the amygdala's threat detection system. So I invite you right now to engage in this thought experiment. Imagine you are holding a magic wand. With one single wave of this wand, you possess the power to instantly and permanently eradicate every internal barrier holding you back.
Okay, so all the anxiety, the imposter syndrome, the fear of financial ruin, the terror of judgment, the suffocating shame, poof, it is entirely gone from your nervous system.
You cannot fail, and no one will ever criticize your choices.
No.
Now, look at your life. With all the fear removed, what would you do? What would your Tuesday look like? What job would you quit? Who would you call? What would you create?
It's a staggering question because it isolates the variable. When you surgically remove the fear of judgment, what is left behind is the unvarnished truth of your actualizing tendency.
Exactly the point. It reveals the trajectory your biology and your true self are trying to take before the acquired mind slams the brakes on. It gives you the coordinates of your authenticity.
But once you have those coordinates, once the magic wand reveals what you actually desire, you need a compass to get there. You need to understand the underlying drivers. And that brings us to a framework developed by Russ Harris, a prominent ACT educator, called the Bullseye exercise.
The Bullseye framework hinges on resolving a massive cognitive error most people make: confusing goals with values. We are conditioned to be a heavily goal-oriented society. A goal is a destination. It is something you can tangibly achieve and cross off a checklist.
Getting a promotion, losing 20 pounds, buying a house, those are goals. Once you achieve them, they're done.
But a value is completely different. A value is an ongoing, never-ending direction of travel. Harris uses the metaphor of a compass.
Yes, a value is like deciding to travel west. You can walk west for the rest of your life, but you will never arrive at a place called west.
You can reach a goal along the way. You can arrive in California, but you can always keep going west. Being a deeply present and loving partner, being fiercely creative, maintaining a posture of lifelong curiosity, those are values. You can never cross being loving off your to-do list.
And Harris structures this by breaking our existence down into 4 distinct manageable domains: work and education, leisure, relationships, and personal growth and health. The exercise requires you to look at each of those 4 quadrants and ask yourself one defining foundational question. What do I want my life to stand for in this area?
Notice the phrasing. Not what do I want to achieve or acquire, but what do I want to stand for? How do I want to behave?
This is the mechanism for building the structural integrity we discussed earlier. Once you define your core values in those 4 domains, you use them as a harsh, objective measuring stick for your current reality.
You evaluate how closely your daily physical actions map onto those values.
Let's say you define your core value in the relationship quadrant as deep, undistracted presence. But then you examine your behavior and you realize you spend 2 hours every night scrolling through social media while your partner sits silently on the couch.
You are in a profound state of incongruence. The Bullseye exercise isn't about shaming yourself. It provides a cartographic map. It shows you exactly where you need to make small, specific behavioral adjustments to pull your actions back into alignment with your stated values.
And to execute those adjustments, you need to know what tools you actually have in your personal toolkit. If you are going to dismantle the role self and build a new life based on your values, you have to leverage your innate strengths.
Right.
But the sources highlight a really critical distinction between how we usually measure strengths in the corporate world versus how positive psychology measures them for authentic living. We are looking at the difference between the popular Clifton Strengths Assessment and the VIA Character Strengths Survey.
It's a vital nuance. Most of us are familiar with tools like Clifton Strengths, which are incredibly useful, but they are primarily oriented toward raw talents, execution, and performance outcomes, usually optimized for workplace productivity.
They measure how good you are at executing tasks, like being highly analytical or being a strategic thinker or having an activator drive.
The VIA Character Strength Survey, however, was developed by the pioneers of positive psychology, and it measures something much deeper. It focuses on universal human virtues and the components of personal well-being. It measures traits like bravery, the capacity for awe, gratitude, social intelligence, and perspective.
Why is shifting our focus to these character strengths so essential for the process of individuation?
It all comes down to physiological and psychological energy conservation. Operating outside of your innate character strengths is exhausting. When you force yourself to utilize skills and behaviors that don't come naturally to you just to maintain a persona, you are hemorrhaging energy.
You are swimming against the current of your own neurobiology.
But when you identify your core inherent character strengths, the virtues that feel effortless to you, and you actively design your daily life and your career to utilize them, the polarity flips. You stop draining energy and you start generating it. You enter a state of flow and vitality because your daily actions are finally subsidized by the immense power of your actualizing tendency.
Okay, so let's visualize this. You do the work. You use the magic wand to bypass the fear. You define your ongoing values using the bullseye. You identify your core character strengths. You are finally aligned.
You're ready to go.
You open the front door, ready to step into the world as your true self, and the absolute millisecond you do, your brain hits the panic button. The imposter syndrome washes over you like a tidal wave.
The acquired mind screams, "Who do you think you are? You're going to make a fool of yourself."
Everyone is going to see you're a fraud. When that biological fear response hijacks your nervous system, what is the protocol?
When the amygdala fires, logic goes out the window. You cannot think your way out of a physiological threat response. You need an immediate, pattern-interrupting intervention. A highly effective protocol for this is the SPNRR technique, heavily utilized in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy.
Let's break down the mechanics of the SPNRR acronym because it is literally a step-by-step manual for disarming a hijacked nervous system.
Step 1 is stop.
The moment you feel the panic or the imposter syndrome rising, you freeze. You physically and mentally halt whatever you are doing. You interrupt the catastrophic thought spiral before it gathers momentum.
Step 2 is breathe. This isn't just about relaxation, it's biology. Taking slow, deep diaphragmatic breaths manually overrides the sympathetic nervous system. It sends a chemical signal to your brain that you are not being chased by a predator.
Step 3 is notice. You become the observer of your own mind. You detach from the emotion and observe it objectively without judgment.
You don't say, "I am a fraud." You say, "I am noticing that my mind is currently producing the thought that I am a fraud. I am noticing my chest is tight."
That detachment is crucial. It separates your identity from the passing cognitive weather. Then you move to step 4, reflect. Once the physiological panic has subsided, you engage the prefrontal cortex. You interrogate the thought.
Where did this fear come from? Is there actual evidence that I am in danger, or is this just an old, expired script from my childhood role self trying to protect me from a threat that no longer exists?
And finally, step 5, respond. Because you created that massive pause, you are no longer reacting blindly out of fear. You now have the cognitive space to deliberately choose a response that aligns with the values you mapped out in the bullseye exercise, rather than defaulting to the safety of the persona.
You created a gap between the stimulus and the reaction, and that gap is where your entire freedom resides. Martha Beck takes this concept of grounding the nervous system even deeper. She introduces a concept called neuroception, paired with a practice she calls ME.
Neuroception, that's a term coined by Dr. Stephen Porges, right?
Yes, it describes how your nervous system is constantly subconsciously scanning your environment and your internal thoughts to evaluate whether you are safe or in mortal danger. It operates entirely below conscious awareness.
Beck points out that when we're trapped in the acquired mind, constantly oscillating between the desperate hope for future success and the paralyzing fear of future failure, a state she calls the ladder of hope and fear, our neuroception is constantly screaming danger.
Our biology thinks we are under attack, which locks us right back into the role self.
And the antidote she proposes is ME, mindfulness and equanimity.
Yes, the practice of mindfulness and equanimity is the deliberate act of dropping your consciousness out of the frantic, time-traveling thoughts in your head and anchoring it violently into the raw physical sensations of your body in the present millisecond.
It means intensely noticing the physical pressure of your feet against the floorboards, feeling the specific temperature of the air in your forearms, hearing the hum of the refrigerator.
By flooding your brain with real-time sensory data, you soothe the neuroception. You prove to your nervous system that right here, right now, in this exact second, you are perfectly safe.
And it is only in that state of profound, grounded safety that the true self can actually come forward and operate. The true self cannot exist in the anxious projections of the future. It only lives in the present moment.
I think the mechanics of that are so empowering. You aren't just trying to think positive thoughts. You are literally hacking your nervous system to create a safe harbor for your authenticity.
But let's take this out of the laboratory and into the real world, because this is where the friction gets incredibly hot. When you actually do this, when you ground your nervous system, align with your values, and stop playing the convenient, predictable role everyone is used to you playing, the external world is going to push back. Hard.
Oh, inevitably. The people in your life built an entire ecosystem around your role self. When you suddenly change the rules of engagement, they're going to panic.
It is the most difficult phase of individuation, and you must anticipate it. Families, friend groups, and corporate environments are systemic machines. They rely on every cog playing its designated part to maintain homeostasis.
When one cog suddenly decides to change its shape and become authentic, the entire machine grinds and sparks. The people who benefited from your lack of boundaries, your perfectionism, or your silence are going to feel deeply threatened.
They will likely accuse you of changing for the worse. They will tell you you've become selfish. The system will exert immense gravitational pull to force you back into the familial box.
So how does a person survive that systemic pushback without just folding and putting the heavy armor right back on?
The sources offer a very potent conceptual framework for surviving this transition, starting with a principle from Quincy Moran, host of the Man vs. Marriage podcast. Moran deals heavily in personal accountability and transformation, and he coined a phrase that perfectly encapsulates what is required here: internal governance.
He states unequivocally, you cannot lead what you do not govern.
I love that phrase, internal governance. Let's really dissect the mechanics of what he means by that in the context of holding boundaries.
Moran is addressing the reality that true, sustainable transformation, whether you are trying to establish a new dynamic in your marriage, redefine your role in your extended family, or pivot your career, must begin with the absolute, unshakable governance of your own internal landscape.
It requires masterful emotional self-regulation.
It means that before you try to manage your mother's reaction or your boss's disappointment, you must keep the commitments you make to yourself first. If your internal world is chaotic, reactive, and easily swayed by the guilt trips of others, your external world will collapse back into the role self.
You have to establish such a rock-solid foundation of self-trust that the external pushback simply bounces off. You have to become an internally governed state before you can negotiate treaties with other people.
That concept of internal governance makes complete logical sense. But I know for a fact that anyone listening who has spent their entire lives in a caretaking or people-pleasing role self is having a massive internal conflict right now.
The acquired mind is screaming, if I prioritize my own internal governance, if I put my true self first and set boundaries with my family, aren't I just being a terrible, selfish person? I have kids. I had aging parents. I have a team relying on me at work. I don't have the luxury of putting myself first.
It is the ultimate psychological trap, and it is the exact mechanism that keeps millions of deeply exhausted, unhappy people locked in their armor until the day they die. But Lindsay C. Gibson provides a clinical reframing of this dynamic that destroys that trap.
She draws a sharp, definitive line between genuine selfishness and the act of self-preservation. Selfishness, in the clinical sense, is the pursuit of momentary, petty indulgence at the direct, malicious expense of others. It is highly reactive and lacks a long-term vision.
Putting yourself first, however, is a structural necessity. It's the absolute requirement of loving yourself and respecting your biology enough to ensure you actually have the capacity to fulfill your larger purpose.
It's the classic oxygen mask on the airplane metaphor, but applied to your entire psychological existence. If you pass out from lack of oxygen, you are completely useless to the person sitting next to you. By prioritizing your own actualization, you're actually increasing your capacity to contribute.
Consider the alternative. If you continue to operate from the exhausted, resentful space of the role self, what are you actually giving to your family? You're giving them a hollow shell. You're giving them short-tempered reactions, chronic fatigue, and a fake smile.
When you operate from the deeply grounded, energized state of the true self, you have boundless, genuine vitality to offer. You have real compassion. You have actual presence. Which version of you is actually serving your family better?
Gibson makes a profound point about the guilt you will inevitably feel during this transition. When you start setting boundaries and saying no, you will feel guilty. But she notes that this guilt is not a signal that you did something morally wrong. The guilt is simply a growing pain. It is the atrophy in the muscle of your authenticity finally being stretched after decades of disuse.
I think that specific reframe, that guilt is just a growing pain, not a moral failure, is going to fundamentally change how people navigate their lives. Guilt is a growing pain. So, as we weather the pushback and we accept the guilt as part of the process, how do we evaluate our social circles? How do we know who can stay in our lives as we evolve and who might need to be left behind?
Gibson recommends implementing what she calls an energy barometer. Your body, your neuroception, is much smarter than your intellect. Pay meticulous attention to your physiological state when you interact with the people closest to you.
The fundamental purpose of a close relationship should be mutual energy generation. If you spend an hour with a friend or a family member and you leave the conversation feeling consistently drained, physically tense, suddenly anxious, or somehow diminished, you must listen to that data.
That is your biology telling you that the environment is toxic to your true self. It is demanding the role self.
And if you try to bring your authentic self to the table and they consistently reject it, if they demand the old you,
Gibson is uncompromising on this front. If the people in your life consistently belittle, mock, or push back against your authentic development, she advises you to shake the dust off your feet. You cannot actualize in soil that is actively trying to poison you.
you must seek out and cultivate a new community, people who are invested in seeing you succeed as the complex, whole person you actually are, not the convenient character you used to play for them.
Shake the dust off your feet. It's a brutal reality to face, but a completely necessary one. And as we undertake this massive, sweeping renovation of our internal and external lives, I think it is vital to remember a core truth highlighted in the sources. Momentum is almost entirely invisible at first.
It is the most challenging phase of the actualizing tendency. The massive transformation of your life begins with one single, quiet, courageous choice. But the external results of that choice rarely manifest immediately.
It is exactly like a seed germinating deep underground. You are doing the grueling internal work, you are setting the boundaries, you are holding the tension, but for weeks or months, the surface of your life might look exactly the same, or might even look worse as the old structures collapse.
You have to trust the biological process. You cannot quit just because the momentum hasn't broken the surface yet. Setbacks and failures are inevitable, but they are completely harmless if your trajectory is aligned with who you really are. You simply observe the setback, course correct, and keep walking west.
So after this massive deep dive, what does this all mean for you tomorrow? Let's trace the incredible arc of this journey one last time.
We began by destroying the myth that authenticity is just a poetic luxury. We realize that you are, at your very core, a biological organism hardwired with an unstoppable, actualizing tendency. Just like that potato in the dark pantry, you are relentlessly driven to reach for the light and fulfill your potential.
But to survive the complexities and emotional deficits of your childhood, you buried that true nature under layers of social masks and conditions of worth. You built an intricate role self to survive the war, and you ended up wandering around in heavy, exhausting armor.
And then, utilizing the blueprint provided by Jung, we recognize that the primary objective of the second half of life is the deliberate, conscious dismantling of that armor. We have to shed the persona.
We have to summon the courage to journey into the basement of our subconscious, integrate the raw power of our shadow, and find that transcendent center where we can hold the tension of our own contradictions.
We cure our profound psychological suffering not by being perfect, but by stepping into absolute, uncompromising integrity. We align our internal reality with our physical actions. We follow the formula. We know ourselves by cutting through the noise. We own ourselves by taking radical responsibility for our flaws and choices. And we be ourselves by acting on our values.
We permanently drop the heavy, exhausting 20-ton shield of perfectionism, and we embrace the terrifying vulnerability required to live wholeheartedly.
And we ground all of this philosophy in daily execution. We bypass our fear with the magic wand. We stop chasing arbitrary goals and start navigating by the compass of our core values. We identify and leverage our innate character strengths to generate energy.
We govern our internal emotional landscape with iron discipline. We reframe the inevitable guilt of boundary setting as a necessary growing pain. And we use our physical energy barometer to ruthlessly curate a circle of people who support our true growth.
It is a monumental undertaking. It is the work of a lifetime. But as the sources brilliantly remind us, you came into this life fully equipped, with batteries included.
You already possess every single biological and psychological tool you need inside of your own nervous system. You don't need to acquire anything else.
You just have to look in the mirror and ask yourself, who exactly are you waiting for permission from to start living your own actual life? You don't need it. The permission is granted. Your actualizing tendency is waiting for you to get out of its way.
Throughout this entire deep dive, we have used the language of becoming. We've talked extensively about becoming authentic, becoming whole, becoming the person you are meant to be.
But as we close, based on everything we have unpacked today regarding the innate true self and the heavy armor of the role self, I want to leave you with one final paradigm-shifting thought to carry with you.
What if becoming who you are meant to be isn't about adding anything new to your life or your personality at all?
What if it is entirely 100% an act of subtraction?
What if the masterpiece of your true authentic self is already completely finished, and your only job for the rest of your life is to simply pick up the chisel and chip away the extra marble?